This is the day that I was you guys have just on one. Ooh.
All right. Welcome back. Let's get started. Happy Friday. Hope you are having a good end of your first week and things are starting to settle in a little bit with your courses and getting all of that squared away. Glad to have folks here and I'm looking forward to diving into some things. We have a few folks who are traveling for track and other events. As a reminder, if you are ever traveling due to athletics and know that you're not going to be able to make it, I always have the recording up after class. Typically, you'll see that up by the time we get to the next class, so you're able to follow along. And if you're gone but able to attend remotely, I have the Zoom link available for you to do that as well. You're sick, if there is a conflict or issue, or you're stuck. So glad to have some of you people back and excited to get started on things today. As a quick recap of what we went over last class, we took some time to talk about what interviewing is, right? It's a good idea if you're taking a class that we define what we're talking about in the course title. We also talked a little bit about the role of interpersonal communication, the idea of significant, meaningful two-way communication between two parties. This is an element of communication that is, of course, incredibly relevant to interviews as we look to build meaningful relationships between two different parties. And we also talked about two different categories of interviews. We talked about a little bit with regard to directive and non-directive styles. We also took some time to talk about some of the different genres, things such as counseling interviews, healthcare interviews, persuasive interviews, employment interviews, many of these categories, which we will be doing in this class so that you can get a feel for them in a bit more detail. So we took some time to talk about the idea that an interview is involving two different parties. A party is different than a person, right? There could be multiple people representing a party like a committee or group. But generally speaking, beyond that point, it's no longer an interview. If you have like 5 or 6 different people, that's generally considered more in the realm of small group communication. Is there anybody who is here for the first time today? Looks like we've settled down a little bit. Again, welcome, glad to have people back. Is there anybody who has any questions about anything we talked about last class or anything about the course in general at this point? Couple questions. Yeah, what's up?
Is an interrogation considered an interview?
So it can be, right? Because it follows the structure. Somebody is asking questions, receiving a response. I think it follows a very defined element of directive interview. You are very specifically being directed, but yes, it would follow the expectations of an interview. Yeah. Depends upon the people involved, right? So if you are asking questions and participating, if all it's doing is assessing like your physical activity, right? That wouldn't necessarily fit in an interview, but if you are being questioned about like how serious you are about it, your ability to balance it with courses, that would fit under that. That element of your triad might include an interview for sure. Good questions as we're kind of defining the scope and boundaries of an interview. We'll get a little bit more into some of those elements and how we can define those as well in the class. So I do want to remind folks that the first quiz is due on this Sunday on Canvas. The first quiz covers that PDF of the first week's readings. So if you don't have access to a textbook, you're welcome to just use that PDF and work through that so that you can work through the quiz. Again, the quiz is open note, open book. It's not designed to trick you. It's just designed to make sure you're working through the reading and understanding the material that we're discussing in class. I do recommend that you make sure you have a copy of the textbook that's secured for the second week. How many folks have already been able to get a copy of the textbook, either face-to-face or either a physical or ebook copy? Okay, so a lot of you. If you haven't, do remember that there is the pretty straightforward option of getting the direct ebook, right? So the Amazon ebook is right here. You can rent a copy for about $33, and that will give you access to that material. So just make sure that you have that for week number 2, since there will not be a PDF of that second week's reading. I'd love to do the whole thing, but then I'd go to jail. So let's take a little bit of time to talk about the first writing assignment in the class. That is the interview analysis essay, right? So we'll be doing a first writing assignment that's not due until the end of week 3. So you have over 2 weeks from now in order to complete it. But I do like to put it on your radar, get you thinking about it, and give you plenty of time to start to brainstorm about this prompt and its expectations. So this prompt is available for you on Canvas. So if you go to the front page of Canvas, it's listed as an assignment coming up. You can also click it right here. So what I'm asking you to do for this assignment is to look at a video interview that's at least 15 minutes in length that is related to a topic that's interesting to you. So for instance, this might be a topic like an interview with a healthcare professional. Perhaps there's an expert you're interested in who's being interviewed. Maybe it is an instructor or professor who's teaching something you're interested in. Or something like a current events interview. There are a lot of interviews that we see through journalism and press, such as 60 Minutes, right? Or you can also look at other examples, for instance, of interviews of celebrities, famous figures that you might be interested in. Things such as late night shows are actually good examples of interviewing because they show us how building comfort, rapport, and the goals between the two different parties might be developed. So I encourage you to really think about different options. We'll be looking at an example of an interview today that will be an example of the type of work that you could look at. And then I'll be asking you to develop double-spaced 3 to 4 pages to first look at the strategies that are used by the interviewer. How are they asking questions? How are they using follow-up questions? How are they engaging with the participant in the interview? And then looking at the strategies that the interviewee and person being interviewed is using, right? How are they responding to questions? What is the perception that they want to be conveyed? And make sure as well that you're including in text and works cited. So the material we've been talking about this week will be a great way to prepare, talking a little bit about some of the ways that interviews are structured and designed. We'll get more into that further next week, talking about questions, how questions are developed, and so on. So that should give you all of the resources that you need. My policy is always that if you would like a rough draft feedback, you're welcome to email me your rough draft, ideally at least 3 days in advance so that I can turn around feedback to you in time. A lot of people who are concerned about getting the grade that they want really benefit from turning in a rough draft or outline ahead of time. Also, it's not required. Also, another option you might think about is if you know that this is a pressure point, the due date for the assignment at the end of week 3 is a time where you're like traveling or you've got another big exam or something else. You can request an extension, right? I encourage you to do that at least a week in advance and let me know to what date you would like the assignment extended. Otherwise, it's -5% for each day something is late. So just wanted to put on your radar that that is coming up and that'll be due on the 23rd. Any questions? Yeah.
So on that essay, since like it's gonna have to be 4 pages, part of it you do like they're talking about, like explaining what's going on in the interview rather than just distracting that are going on.
So in order for us to understand the strategy, you can, yes, include some quotations, some examples, some passages, and some details that's describing what's going on in the interview, right? What I don't want is a page-long block quotation that's a transcript of the interview, right? I do want it to be focused on your own perspective and analysis, but you're definitely welcome to dedicate some of that time to explaining and showing us those elements of the interview. Your question. Any other questions? Great. So continue to think about and start to develop some ideas on what that might look like. Again, as we're talking in this class, we'll be looking at a lot of different examples of types of interviews and the ways in which interview strategies work. For today, we're going to be looking about the building blocks of interviews, how interview structure can be used effectively, and some of the ways in which factors such as culture and gender can impact the interviewing process. So the first week's reading presents a very big, multifaceted model of interviewing, right? This is something we're going to be breaking down and exploring more in this class. But all that to say, there are a lot of different things that go down in an interview, even if you're just looking at it and saying, oh, it's just two people talking, right? We have to consider the roles and background, both the interviewer and interviewee. We have to consider the perceptions, right, or the assumptions and beliefs that people have. We have to consider the role of feedback and the ways in which factors such as noise and response to messages are happening. We have to consider outside factors such as family, friends, professional relationships that are shaping things too. We have to think about some of the variables, right? Are you having an interview in a loud room where a lawnmower is going off outside, right? Those are all factors that are going to impact the interviewing process and ways in which people are able to communicate effectively with each other. Wanted to highlight, I think, a good example of some of the ways that we can parse out some of the dynamics of interviews. How many folks have seen the YouTube video series Hot Ones? Okay, so several of you, right? This is a series in which celebrities and famous figures are being interviewed, but in the process, they're being asked to eat increasingly spicy hot wings. So I wanted to share a clip from one of these. It was a recent video in which the actress Jenna Ortega from Wednesday, Scream, and a variety of horror films is being interviewed. Because I think one thing we can really gain from watching this interview is an understanding of how these different steps are playing out, how the different roles and strategy are being used, and how comfort and disclosure is happening in the interview process as well.
How are you feeling?
I feel really good.
I can see it.
I've never been happier.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? First week piece, I'm Sean Evans. You're watching Hot Ones. It's the show with high questions, even how to rank. Hey, we're joined by Jenna Ortega. She's a Golden Globe nominated actor, developed acclaimed films like X, The Fallout, as well as the massive global Netflix hit Wednesday. She also stars in Scream 6, the latest chapter in the iconic slasher franchise, which is set to release in theaters on March 10th. Jenna Ortega, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I know that you're a big fan of hot sauce. How confident are you going into today's?
I'm feeling pretty confident, honestly. I haven't been nervous at all. It's only been within the last 30 minutes that my friends that are with me today have kind of been amping me up, and I've realized, oh, this might be a situation that I'm not prepared for. But typically, I can handle my stuff, so I'm curious.
Add in the middle, that's great.
Tomatoes. This is what's hot right now. Here we are. Now it's like only in theaters.
Yeah.
All right.
Sweet. Baby. Egg wing. I do have to tell you too, the gift from my father's Christmas gift was the hot sauces. Oh. I pledged not to do any of them because I thought if I ever go on the show, I cannot do it or whatever. But I feel like I come from a strong family. Mm-hmm. They've got strong pieces.
So you returned for your role as Terry Carpenter in Scream 6, a franchise I've really come to appreciate for its meta commentary on the genre, where each film becomes like its own love letter to classic horror movies of the past. What are the hallmarks of a good chase for you? Like, when they work on film, what makes them work?
Ooh, for a good chase scene, it's really difficult. I feel like you have to have like you gotta have a good course. You know, like the amount of rooms that you run through. I think a good handheld shot is also really necessary for a good chase scene because it makes it feel a lot more chaotic and a bit more first-person view. I feel like it's a bit more intense for the audience. But at least a couple of injuries, a couple of stabs here and there. And I also think a really powerful shot, one of my favorite things in horror films is when you can see your heroine, your main character, and then you can see the other villain kind of in the background. I feel like anything where it's like either they're not aware that they're there or you can see the reaction and the mayhem going on behind them. That's always a strong choice. All right. Too easy.
There we go.
I don't want to get too confident, but at the same time.
You gotta gas yourself up as you go,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, I feel like around 6 is when people start getting weird.
Right. Just enjoy this time while you got it, you know? So you gushed about your experience working with the master of Gothic fantasy and Tim Burton. How did you see his obsession with aesthetic come through in the way that he directs?
First of all, he draws a lot of his shots. So there were some days where I would come into work and he would have his own little picture that he drew. He was playing the cello and be fencing and say, "This is what you're shooting." That. Or even on the first day when they were trying to establish what my hair was going to look like, we ran 2 hours behind because no, our braids are uneven. This one's lower, this one's higher. He didn't like the way that my fringe looked at the time, so he was just, "Hey, do you mind if I do that?" He asked the hairdresser very politely and just kind of did my hair himself. It would be like 4 in the morning in some random Romanian forest, and where's Tim? And he's carrying 2 trees, throwing them in the background of the shots so that they land exactly where he wanted them to. He was very specific and like happy to do it himself, but also a really great communicator and collaborator.
Did you come out on the other side of the deep dive into his catalog with a favorite Tim Burton production?
I mean, I feel like Beetlejuice is a staple, so I've always appreciated Beetlejuice, but I also, when I was younger, I wanted to be one of the aliens from Mars Attacks so bad. But not the Lisa Marie one, the one with the exposed brain. Jack Nicholson, Glenn Close in there, like it's an incredible movie. I feel like people don't give it the credit it deserves.
Wildly underrated. Wildly underrated.
Yes.
All right, so far 2 rings down.
So I'm not going to share the whole interview, but I did think that showing these for several minutes is a great job. Does a great job of establishing a lot of these elements that we've been talking about and we'll be exploring in a little bit more detail. We can almost think about like how the progressively spicy wings are almost a metaphor for the interview process, because as the interview continues, right, people become more comfortable asking more personal and yes, heated questions, right? Part of what makes these styles of interviews really fun, you ever seen, for example, Jerry Seinfeld did a similar series called Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, where it's exactly what it sounds like, where he's interviewing people in that setting, right? A lot of what makes these types of interviews fun is that they're putting celebrities and figures in a situation that is kind of putting them out of their comfort zone, right? Where it's creating some instant, easy icebreakers where people are like eating the wings and talking early on in the interview about, her preparing for it. She's talking about how easy it is, right? They're using that as an early conversation starting point to get to know and build rapport with each other. We also know, as we're getting into the questions from Sean, right, he's done his research. He has a lot of interest in particular with what Jenna's relationship with Tim Burton was like, who worked on development of the show Wednesday, right, and talking a little bit about how her experience in the genre is connected to him, using follow-up questions about how she was able to learn more from him, right? So developing a closer relationship that's looking at an interesting thread that he's clearly invested in, wants to learn more about. You can also think about, right, if you are a famous person, you're probably interested in getting on a show like that because that can help with your credibility, with your background, with your public perception. So she definitely has an incentive to be there too. So we can think about how the role of comfort and developing comfort is developed in this interview, the role of things like outside factors, a lot of questions that celebrities might be asked by a lot of fans and people interested in watching might bring in as well. the public perception of somebody, what is their reputation to an outsider. Those are all factors that are playing in as well. So I think this is a good example here of how steps in an interview can happen, even if it's in more a lighthearted and fun way, where people are building connection, they're building rapport, they're building greater comfort over the course of an interview through the interactions that people have. So one really important starting point is to understand in a bit more detail how different parties in communication work together in an interview, right? You can think about it kind of like a Venn diagram, where you have one party who's coming in with their own set of interests, the other who's coming in with their own, and they're finding this point of commonality with each other, right? There are probably a lot of details from Jenna's experience that are pretty boring, that are not interesting. There are also a lot of questions that perhaps Sean has that she doesn't really know the answer or want the answer to. But what they're finding is this space together where they're both interested, they both want to participate and answer questions together. If you're doing something like a job interview, right? You're interested in the job, they're interested in hiring you, there's this point in the middle here, right? So a party is coming into an interview with a variety of different experiences. They're coming in with their educational and cultural background. They're coming in with their training, right? One thing that's often talked about is how good of an interviewer certain hosts are. What are the kinds of questions they ask? How much do they challenge an interviewee? How much do they engage with them? So that's an important element here. What are they bringing in? Clearly, Sean has a lot of interest in understanding some of the nitty-gritty of Jenna's filmography and her experience working with directors, right? So the parties coming into an interview are bringing in their own stakes, goals, and assumptions. Whenever you walk into an interview, regardless of the roles, what you need to ask yourself is, what do I want when I come out of this, right? And if you don't have an answer to that question, you're probably not prepared. If I want, coming out of a job interview, to be thought of as a good qualified candidate, or from asking questions and interviewing somebody, I want to understand certain things that I don't know about this candidate and see if they're a good fit. If I'm asking somebody about their health, right, I'm doing a healthcare counseling oriented interview, I want to understand what's bothering them and what they're looking for support. So understanding what parties are bringing into an interview, which does not always align with itself, that can be a source of tension, right? One thing that we've seen are examples, for instance, of popular figures. For example, former President Trump was known for, in certain situations, being asked questions in an interview and ending or exiting the interview because he was not comfortable with the line of questions or the direction the interview was headed, right? So there can be clashes in some of the goals and perspectives of people in the interviews as well. People have a lot in common, right? That can happen in interviews, but we don't want to assume that, right? We don't want to assume on the basis of somebody's gender or race that they're going to have the same experiences that we do. And at times, making assumptions about people in the interview process can be a way to create distance. So I think going into an interview, understanding what you have in common, but not walking in with assumptions about things you might have in common is a really important element for us to look at as well. Some other things to think about here are roles, right? And some of the ways in which gender and cultural differences can shape our communication too. If we think about culture, we are thinking about the totality of experiences, traditions, practices that are passed down, right? We can think about culture in terms of ethnicity, but also in terms of membership, in particular groups, clubs, activities, and legacy. Not one person is a single culture, right? But culture can be found through the experiences that we pass on with each other. And that's going to impact the way that we communicate and the way that we interview with each other. There are a variety of examples in this week's text that get into some of the differences. For example, individuals who are American are more likely to pursue more informal relationships. We're generally seen as pretty extroverted and interested in forming a lot of connections with people. Whereas it's common in Germany for people to avoid using first names until they become more connected and trusting of one another, right? So one of the challenges of interviewing and engaging with people from different cultures and backgrounds is to understand that what's comfortable to you and makes sense to ask as a question might not be comfortable to the other person. So figuring out ways to bridge that difference and find that space in the middle that is accommodating for both parties is an important step toward being a good interviewer, right? For example, if you're interviewing people for a job, perhaps there's something that culturally a group is not familiar with, such as a norm or behavior. People might not know what, for instance, Slack is, which is an app that's used in order to have people in employment communicate with each other. So clarifying that information can be a good way to bridge the gap. Over time, we've seen the idea of gender play out in communication too, right? Gender being a discussion of the ways in which various practices, behaviors are culturally expressed and defined. So we know from a lot of different cultures, including indigenous cultures, cultures throughout the world, that what it means to do and practice gender looks very different, right? And continues to evolve and change. But what we do know is that the process of socialization, people coming into perspectives and backgrounds that are gendered, oftentimes predisposes individuals to communicate in different ways. So for instance, generally speaking, men are oftentimes more socialized to be goal-oriented. What am I hoping to get out of this? Good example is whenever my dad went to the grocery store, he'd always say, well, I want to go in and out. I have my list. I want to get what I want and I want to leave, right? Women tend to be socialized toward being more expression-oriented in communication and interviewing, right? This is not to suggest these factors are biologically defined, rather to say that in many cultures and situations, individuals are sort of primed and socialized to communicate in different ways, depending upon the roles and background that they've experienced, right? And if we think about gender diverse cultures and perspectives, we generally see a pretty wide range in these as well. We also know that the roles that people take on in interviews will alternate. One really good way to prepare for something like a good job interview is to come in with your own questions, right? It is really impressive to an employer if you're coming in with a number of questions for them that show you've done your homework and you have interest in the position, right? Additionally, asking questions is a way for you to clarify if it's a fit. If you think about it this way, if somebody is interviewing you for a job, you're also interviewing them to the extent you're figuring out if they're going to be a good fit and if you would accept an offer from them if they gave it to you, right? So asking questions is an important element here, right? I just took my dog into the vet yesterday, and I asked a number of questions too because I wanted to understand her health and figure out all that stuff. So coming in with your own set of questions and not just assuming that all the questions are going to be asked to you and all you need to do is respond is an important element here. The same way, if you are an interviewer, you should come in prepared to answer questions that people are bringing in too. So bringing in that preparation is important as we're considering the different roles that people take on. We talked a little bit about this last class, but one element that's important here is the difference between a more directive and a more non-directive style, right? In a more directive style, that means that the person doing the interviewing has a lot of control over the process. They have a very specific set of questions, and they're going to ask those questions in a very formal and structured way. This is really common in a lot of state jobs, right? Or working for something like a city or government or authority, because they have to follow a lot of state and federal guidelines in how they ask questions, right? They can't go off script and ask people and be very free flowing. They have to have a script that they follow in order to ask the questions and make sure that people are being evaluated in the exact same way. So to get to that earlier question, yes, an interrogation is type of interview because you are asking questions. You're doing so in a directed way. Generally speaking, if you are trying to provide information, if you're doing something like a survey or poll, right? If you're surveying like people's customer satisfaction or you're trying to understand their positions on political candidates, you're going to ask the same questions to each people to make sure that you have results that can be measured and applied. Like on a scale of 1 to 5, are you unsatisfied or very satisfied, right? That's information that can be used from each interviewee and organized effectively. On the flip side, we've got non-directed interviews, right? So we can look at the example, Jenna's interview was a much more non-directive style, where it was inviting follow-up questions, open-ended engagement. Sean even started the interview kind of letting Jenna talk about what her preparation for being on the show was, talking about how he had received hot sauce over the holidays and was trying to prepare, right? The non-directive approach is inviting people to talk about the information that they're giving. This can be really good if you're interested in what people see as important and what people particularly want to bring into the understanding of the interviewer. It's also useful by presenting open-ended questions to see how people solve problems. It also helps people to allow the interviewee to really express and share parts of themselves in a way that can really help them to feel like they're able to build a connection. So non-directive approach is often common in counseling, right? People might come in a much more open-ended way or ask more open-ended questions. What are some things you're interested in talking about? What are some things that came up for you this week? Using the open-ended style is a great way to engage with people. And then using things like more oral history, performance reviews, those are types of interviews that work well for the open-ended style too. For example, perhaps you know a veteran of World War II and you want to understand what their experience was like. What was the perspective from, growing up in this context, and letting somebody tell their story is generally something we see done really well in this non-directive approach. An important step in the communication process is what's known as perception, right? We can think about perception as the pair of glasses that we wear, right? If you're wearing sunglasses, that's going to change the way that you look at the world around you. Some colors are going to be much more highlighted. Some colors are going to be dimmer, right? The way that you look at the world is ultimately your perception of it, right? So the idea, we're both looking at a table, but what is our own experience with tables in the past? What does this table make you think of? Have you sat in this table in the past? Like those things are shaping your perception. In other words, our understanding of who we are and how we operate in this world is developed through communication, right? Identity is developed by using language and communication to understand who we are and to compare ourselves to others. If you think about describing yourself, you're using language to do that. You're putting yourself into categories and labels. Maybe you're introverted, maybe you're extroverted, right? Those categories are assigned through the communication process, and through our relationships with other people, we come to develop a sense of identity. Quest for identity is the modern pilgrimage. Self-esteem is the process of gaining approval, right? Understanding who we are, but also in terms of how other people value us and understand our goodness or badness as humans. So if we know who we are, right, we think that that's a good thing or not. That would be the role of self-esteem. Respect and support are connected here, right? If you have more respect and support from those around you, you're going to have higher self-esteem, and generally you're going to perform and do better in the situation. If you have lower self-esteem, generally speaking, you're more anxious, you're more concerned, and you don't have the resources to do well. In something like an interview, right, if you come across as intimidating, as asking questions, being very interrogative in your style, that's likely going to have an impact on the interviewee's self-esteem and comfort in the interview. They're going to be more likely to clam up, less likely to share and disclose information, right? So in looking at a successful interview, like that example we saw, somebody's ability to be open, to be accepting, to show interest in the person and their activities is a good way to help the interview open up effectively. We can also think about culture and gender here, right? So one element that differs from a lot of cultures and ethnic groups is the idea of individualism versus collectivism. In more individualistic cultures like the United States, things like personal achievement and success are valued. In more collectivist cultures, such as China and Japan, there's a greater emphasis on the needs of the group. So we place more emphasis on our own value or the value of something such as a family that brings in a lot of significance to how we're assessed and judged as well. For instance, a practice that would be seen as shameful doesn't just impact the person, it impacts their family and more collectivist culture, right? So that can shape how we perceive and understand each other. It can also create differences in how much is considered appropriate to disclose. Think about the example of Germany of generally not referring to people on a first name basis unless you get to know and understand them better, right? So when we're asking in an interview for people to self-disclose and share information, the level of response we're going to get and the perceived appropriateness of disclosure is going to look really different too, right? You don't want to overshare in the beginning of an interview. That can send a red flag, but you also don't want to come across as too distant in the interview either. So there's what's known as a politeness theory that plays out in interviews. So it's kind of a funny example here. of somebody who's trapped on an island. They say, help me, right? And somebody says, say, please, as they're flying by and not helping the person. So one of the challenges to communication is that oftentimes people are wanting to be polite, they're wanting to be respectful, they're wanting to be diplomatic. And as a result of this, in the effort to protect and support people, politeness might be used as a cause of deception. One of the biggest examples that we might think about from an interview is, don't call us, we'll call you, or we'll be in touch, when somebody has been interviewed who is very clearly not going to get the position at all, right? There's a lot of formality. There are a lot of kind of practices that we see play out in an interview. It might be seen as dishonest and not actually representing the communication that's unfolding, right? A desire to maintain good relationships with people oftentimes can come at the expense of honesty. So one of the biggest problems that happens in the communication process is assuming that people understand and are on the same page, that people are understanding the messages that we're sharing to each other because we use the same language. If somebody came out in an interview and thought, oh, that went great, and they said, oh, we'll be in touch, but clearly in the interview they were not a good candidate, and the interviewer was very clearly showing that they were not qualified, right? There might be a misperception or misunderstanding that's exacerbated by being polite and diplomatic to each other, right? When you're stuck in an interview, you're stuck asking and responding to questions. You can't necessarily exit the interviews easily. So oftentimes politeness is used in order to maintain the peace in the interview while it's happening. So that can be a challenge, right? To make sure that there's honesty in the process of interviewing people. So many of you who have taken a class like interpersonal are familiar with the significance of nonverbal communication here too, right? Nonverbal communication is rather than what you say, it's how you say it, right? So nonverbal communication is up to 90% of the way that we communicate, and we're more likely to trust the nonverbal communication than the verbal communication. If somebody said, it's great to see you, and they're rolling their eyes and saying it in a sarcastic tone of voice, we're more likely to interpret it as sarcasm. They're not happy to see us, even though the word said that they were. So that's important, right? If we want to interview and be interviewed effectively, we need to make sure that our nonverbal communication is on point. So nonverbal communication is how we're giving or not eye contact, right? If you're being interviewed and you're on your phone, that would generally be seen as very disrespectful of the people's time. The way that you're using a facial expression, perhaps you're conveying interest, you're conveying excitement. Part of what makes series like Hot Ones fun, right, is the nonverbal communication. They're getting like red in the face, they're getting increasingly anxious and uncomfortable, and that's a way of breaking the ice and allowing people to share more details about their lives. Gestures and touch, right? So the way that people are physically expressing themselves. One really good way to do this, and if you're interviewing somebody and maybe you're gathering information, like you have a relative and you want to know their life story, one really good rule of thumb is that the more that they gesture, the more they are interested, they're engaged, and they want to share that detail, right? So people who are gesturing more are generally more passionate and interested in the topic, and using gestures is a way of indicating your interest. How you use things like silence or the lack of communication matters too. If you are not sure how to respond to a question and you're silent for a number of seconds, that can be a challenge. So nonverbal communication is important. It's also things such as our tone of voice, our inflection, right? The audio and sound qualities that go into how we communicate. So those are all factors that we look at and evaluate in the communication process. Does this person really seem like they're interested, right? Or maybe we are giving a counseling interview and we realize that a person says they're doing fine, but they seem really distressed, right? They're going to dig into that more and use the nonverbal communication to understand that person a little bit better. This also plays into the importance of listening, right? When you are interviewing, listening is incredibly crucial, and understanding the type of listening that you're using for that situation is really important too. So listening is not your ears picking up on sensory information, right? It's not picking up on vibrations, understanding a sound, and being able to know what that person is saying, right? Listening is about more than that. It is not only that you're able to comprehend information, but that you're able to utilize that information, you remember, you respond, you use verbal and nonverbal feedback. Listening is how we not only take in information, but we make sense of it. We use it in our own lives, right? And that's incredibly important in an interview, because if you were just hearing the question and you're not really thinking through what that question is or what that question is talking about, then you're not really engaging fully in an interview. So there are a few different ways that you can utilize the listening process over the course of an interview. One is listening for comprehension, which is really understanding and remembering the message for later. We oftentimes do this in much more informational interviews where we're trying to gather data and understand somebody's experience. You survived this war. Tell me a little bit about this. Tell me what your experience was like. If somebody was doing, for example, a biography of somebody, they would be using this type of listening style. Empathy is showing concern, understanding, involvement. This is oftentimes used in something like a counseling interview, right, where somebody is sharing information and really trying to be available as a source of support and show their interest and attention. Listening for evaluation, right, is where you are judging, criticizing, but this can be a good thing, right? For instance, if you're evaluating job candidates and you're evaluating their answer to a question about their previous qualifications, that's important. You want to listen and really pay attention to whether or not they have experiences that are relevant to the current job. And then listening for resolution is listening to try to solve a problem. If you're listening, right, to somebody who's expressing a concern in their performance review, right, so they say, you know, I couldn't get on my email, so I couldn't answer these messages, you're listening to try to figure out and troubleshoot perhaps how you resolve issues with their email. The last thing that I want to highlight before we do an attendance prompt for today is the importance of seating and the ways in which how we physically orient an interview space shapes the interview itself, right? So one of the most common ways to structure a face-to-face interview that builds comfort is to have a table in which people are arranged accordingly, right? So you have an interviewer, interviewee, and they are positioned in this way. It's designed to reduce kind of the power difference, and it's designed to make things a little bit more conversational. Another structure that might be common, right, is you have somebody at their desk, interviewer, interviewee here. That's commonly used, but it might create this perception of difference, right? You've got this table standing in the way. There are other arrangements. Maybe people are just talking, right? There's what's known as a cattle call, where people are more just casually conversing with one another in an interview. Sometimes in a larger group, you have a table in a more kind of round setting. So the way that you're structuring the physical layout and organization of the interview is going to impact its structure as well. So there's a little bit of distance between Jenna and Sean, right? There's the wings, there's the different sauces and condiments, right? And that's shaping the way that they're relating and communicating with each other. Perceptions are going to be different, right? So sometimes people think, oh, an interview went great. And the interviewer says, oh, I can't believe how badly they did, right? So our assumptions about the interview process are going to be pretty different as well. So understanding the interviews are shaped by a lot of these different factors, by the space that we're using, by the positioning of people relative to one another, by the relationships that are formed and the context that's being brought into those arrangements are all important elements for us to explore as well. So what I would like you to do is to take some time on your own in the remaining time that we have for today. So going forward, I will be asking you to complete various activities for attendance. Sometimes this is an individual prompt, a partner activity, a group activity. For today, I want you to take some time on your own to write or type, and welcome to either email it to me or pass it forward with your name on it if you're writing on a piece of paper. I want you to take some time to think about an interview that you've been involved in either an interviewer or interviewee role. Who are the parties in that interview, right? So what was your experience? What was the other party's experience? Think about nonverbal communication. As you recall this interview, how did this nonverbal communication happen? How did this shape the way that the interview played out? And lastly, I want you to think about those 4 types of listening that we've talked about, which were used in this interview, and why do you believe that particular type of listening was used in the interview? So I'll ask you to take a couple more minutes here. So go ahead and finish what you're currently working on with your sentence, thought, or idea. Wanted to do this to help you to think a bit more about some of the interviews you've been involved in, some of the nuts and bolts of interviews you've experienced, and the ways in which interviews that you've had might or might not have followed the elements of structure that we talked about today. So for today, we took some time to talk a bit about the elements of interviews that go into understanding and shaping that model. Your reading for this week gets into more nitty-gritty details about the model, and I encourage you to take a look at that in preparation to the week 1 quiz. We also talked about how elements of culture and gender are shaping the interviewing process too, and how nonverbal expression, things like facial expression, tone of voice, are shaping the way that we're understanding interviews together as well. On Monday, we'll look at one of the most important things in an interview, and that is questions. How do we develop, ask questions effectively, and utilize questions in the interviewing process? So be thinking about what you might want to do for your interview observation assignment. Make sure to complete the quiz by the end of the week, by Sunday. And please pass forward or email me your attendance activity for the day if you haven't done so already. Have a great weekend, and I will see you all next week.